Gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. Welcome to this latest series in our Centenary lecture series now. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you back for those of you who took some time off over the summer. And for those of you who did not, then I'm hope that you've managed to keep enough of your COVID energy going to be able to really enjoy what I think will be an important set of meetings that we're going to hold through the remainder of this, our centenary year. We are very, very pleased to have with us Susana Malcorra, who I was saying to her just before we started the session is going to bring us her own personal view, but it's a personal view that is also from Latin America. And I think being able to have a perspective that is not just some of the ones that we get more often in London, which tend to be European and US and sometimes from other parts of the world heading east. It's great that we've gone west. She is now based in Madrid as the Dean of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs, a very highly respected business and international affairs school, which I've had the pleasure of visiting and working with myself in the past. Many of you will know her as the former foreign minister of Argentina, and a particularly important role she played, which also got her, as we were discussing earlier, into the WTO space of the world. But she did a good chunk of her career at the United Nations, where she joined, I think in 2004, but she was the chief operating officer of the World Food Programme at some moments of particular crisis around that time. She went on to become a UN Undersecretary General in field support and was involved in some of the big crises that took place there with the tsunami that took place around Indonesia and in the Pacific. She became in 2012 a chief of staff, or the chief of staff under Ban Ki-moon for the executive office of the UN, and did some very important roles there, coordinating the removal of chemical weapons from Syria, was involved in the Ebola crisis. In any case, I could go on. She's well placed to be able to discuss the future of international organizations, and the title we've given her today, Global Organizations in an Isolationist World. And I'm very much looking forward to her thoughts on that particular angle. But I did want to say as well, for those of you who don't know Susana Malcorra, she had a good 25 years in the private sector prior to that, at IBM, Telecom Argentina. So again, she is somebody with a very wide range of experience and knowledge, and a set that she's brought to good use, and that we're very much looking forward to drawing on for this next in our centenary lecture series. And Susana, thank you for joining us today. We've got an hour. I want to remind everyone here, obviously this is on the record. You can tweet at hashtag #CHEvents. And I will repeat this later on, but questions should be posed through the Q&A function, please. We have disabled the chat, so don't use the chat. And raise hand is not relevant either. Please put your question in the Q&A. We may be able to call on some of you to ask your question in person, but we will sort them through the Q&A function, and you can upload at any time, up-like by clicking the like button, the questions to get them to the top. But I'm going to start with organization and introduction here. And Susana, hand it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to the conversation and your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me to start by thanking Dr. Nibet, I should say Robin, for the honor of addressing this audience in the context of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Chatham House. In this day and age of rapid changes and very short memories, there are not many institutions that can pride themselves of retaining respect and recognition after 100 years of existence. So one can only say, chapeau. I've been requested, as Robin just said, to speak about global organizations in an isolationist world. As you may well imagine, this is, given my background, a subject that I care about and I think about with passion. It's a little bit unfair what expectations this title sets, because I think people might believe that I'll be able to address all the issues and have all the answers to all the questions pertaining the multilateral system. let me start being very clear from up front. That's not going to be the case. If anything, I might be able to pose some of the right questions, but I am not sure I have all the answers to it. Often people talk about the current status of the world as something related to what is happening since President Trump took office in 2017. I find this to be the wrong moment to start my considerations. In my view, the crisis we face vis-a-vis multilateralism and global governance started much earlier and in totally different circumstances. I will argue that all of this started on September 12, 2002. That was the day when the President of the United States, the world's most powerful country and the architect of his post-war order, stood on the floor of the UN General Assembly and threatened the existence of the organization, speaking in the high rhetoric of international diplomacy. He laid out his case for war and told his nervous audience that they had a simple choice: go along with America's policy or become irrelevant. For me, this is a seminal point from which we can then build the rest. Very interestingly, it is very hard to find a case be made for this date to be the beginning of the institutional crisis we face. But the fact is that the country that offered the beginning of all the treaties, of which made a semi-predictable order, was about to shatter a key provision of the foundational text of international law with all its implication. A real milestone in our history, at least in the recent history since World War II. Of course, 9/11 was the precursor of this event. At first, that moment actually deepened international cooperation, bringing even more countries into the American-led system as myriad countries from all walks of political life moved to condemn Al-Qaeda, and by the way, had their own interest in seeing Islamic terrorism dealt with forcefully. A wide coalition of partners joined forces with the US in Afghanistan. Cooperation on counterterrorism efforts seem, although briefly, to create a lens through which to drive cooperation between the US, Russia, and China, as well as Europe, I should say, although Europe had a more liberal view of the role of human rights issues in the counterterrorism response all along. And reflecting the post-war tradition, marrying security and economic cooperation made the Bush administration see the merit of agreeing to a new round of trade negotiations designed to create benefits for the major developing nations that has just opened to globalization, especially India, Brazil, and China, which had completed its negotiations to join the GATT, soon to be retooled WTO. So this is the beginning of it. And you can see the full circle here because part of what happened at the time was to reinforce the trade system to enable the global South to come in. This sense of possibility of cooperation dissipated over time, though. This has multiple sources. There were frustrations with the poor results of American strategy in Afghanistan, and serious concerns with the American move to the Iraqi theater, which strained the incipient coalition. Bush's withdrawal from Kyoto increased the sense of tension within the West, and the Doha round of trade talks stalled as the West encountered the political difference between exporting liberal values abroad on the one hand, and absorbing domestic costs to advance them on the other. These tensions, which still remains today. Nevertheless, the scale of American power and the absence of alternative economic or security orders left the US broadly in command of the dynamics of international order and the multilateral system. Three things came together to bring this phase of what one might describe as assertive American multilateralism to a close. Most important, the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 imposed a vast cost on the US Treasury and strained relations between Washington and its closest allies, many of whom, like Germany, rejected the Bush-Obama approach to stimulus, stoking resentment on both sides of the Atlantic. Shortly thereafter, the Arab Spring roiled North Africa and the Middle East, miring the United States into ever deeper entanglement in the region with ever less effective results, and creating opportunities for Russia's spoiling, also straining relations with Europe, who saw a mounting crisis in their immediate backyard, a crisis eventually reflected in destabilizing refugee flows in Europe. And all of this at the exact moment that the rising powers were beginning to exert influence in the global economy and in multilateral affairs. I could speak about a long list of acute contemporary crises and challenges to international security, prosperity, and liberty. The fact is that even while the G20 and other instruments of global cooperation were unfolding during the Obama administration, there were certain driving forces that were really pushing counter to that. Let me mention them. First one, the dynamics of conflict were changing. Second, the politics of globalization and trade were changing. Third, the provision of global public goods was stalling. And fourth, and to be this a chapeau to the other three, great power tensions were rising. All of this was seriously eroding the prospects of multilateral order. Let me go through each one of them one by one. Starting with the dynamics of conflict. Along with progress on poverty reduction, international cooperation to tackle wars and mitigate their effects was one of the signatures of the multilateral system in the post-Cold War period. This was true, and peacekeeping operations were thriving at the time, together with other interventions on cooperation that were at the center. Reality today is that terrorism and conflict are even more interconnected. The numbers tell a very stark story. Between 2013 and 17, fully 93% of all battle-related deaths occur in countries in which a terrorist organization, as defined by the UN's Security Council, was operating. This violence is heavily concentrated in the Middle East, which accounted for 70% of all battle deaths during the same period. This is particularly challenging given the region's strategic resources and that make it historically resistant to great power or multilateral conflict management. So those management tools are not there. It is also true that conflict terrorism fusion has overtaken any peacekeeping efforts. We do not have the tools to handle this reality. Second, on the politics of globalization. The win-win logic of expanding trade and increased globalization held true at the level of national GDP, but not at the level of political salient constituents. Globalization has always had winners and losers, but the winners had more power than the losers, This was true until the global financial crisis rippled through the working class economies of America, Britain, Germany, Spain, Greece, and virtually every other OECD country. Then the political balance began to shift. And this really changed the dynamics of globalization, and it changed it at the level of the streets. Regarding the third element, the provision of political public goods, though less attention was paid to the issue at the time, there were during this period also important reversals in the international capacity to provide global public goods. Cooperation against transnational terrorism began to falter, cooperation on poverty reduction slowed, and of course, the Doha round, as I mentioned, stalled. Climate change negotiations continue, but were very, very unsatisfactory. COVID provides us with an early example of the consequences of this reality in global public goods. It was during this phase that an increase in the disputation between the established and rising powers that the infectious disease monitoring capacity of the WHO was weakened. That capacity was built in the 90s after the scare of the avian flu in 1997. In the wake of the SARS outbreak in 2004-2005, intense negotiations in the World Health Assembly ultimately came down to the US-China showdown. Perhaps this is the first example of a G2 interaction. A late night agreement between the two laid the stage for adoption of the far-reaching international health regulations of 2005, with their expansive provisions for infectious disease monitoring by national authorities. And now we wonder what happens with WHO vis-a-vis COVID. The political effects of the global financial crisis continue to weaken public goods provisions elsewhere. The emergence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq was met by squabbling among the leading powers and repeated blockage in the Security Council. And in the 2017 ministerial round of WTO, which I happened to chair in Buenos Aires, India put the final nail in the coffin of the Doha round. There were two important exceptions one must mention, which I feel very, very close to because I was part of those processes. In 2015, an agreement was finally reached on climate change, albeit one that involves the states making commitments that they had not always credible industrial pathway to fulfill. If well understood still and applied, this could set the tone for national policies that will address some of the demands of citizens in most countries and could bring creative cooperation opportunities. And also in 2015, in fact, before, because this was in September and the Paris Accord was in December, the United Nations adopted Agenda 2030 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, a set of far-reaching objectives with a holistic perspective on sustainable growth that encompass not just the developing, but also the developed world. Very, very important milestone. It's arguable here that the Trump administration anti-multilateralism instincts are most damaging. The decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accord dramatically weakens the regime, even as state and city administrators and many American businesses have attempted to preserve progress on carbon reduction. And the mind-boggling most recent decision to walk away from the WHO amidst the coronavirus pandemic weakened even more a key institution at a vital junction. Should the politics of withdrawalism continue in the US, it will be very hard to organize global public goods provision. Still, I should say, some parts of the global public goods response can be carried out by others, notably by middle powers, both of the West and the global South, and that should continue. Let me now speak about the last element, the one that I consider the chapeau of the three ones that I just described, and that is the rise of geopolitical tensions. The management of international security, efforts to adapt globalization, and the provision of reliable global public goods, those are core goals of the multilateral system. They are at the center of the Charter. Every one of them is made more complicated by the fourth challenge, the erosion of relations between the world's biggest players. The rise in geopolitical tensions during the past decade not only complicates every facet of the multilateral order, it constitutes a major challenge in its own right. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, we face the serious prospect of military hostilities between the world's major military powers. In this, of course, it is essential also to highlight the shift in domains of warfare from the traditionally military sphere to the political, economic, and the technological ones. Russia and China, being very different in their mighty and strategy, are challengers in this power fight. Both countries have very different approaches. Let me talk in particular about China, which has taken less brazen but arguably more consequential approach to the non-military domain of competition by steadily increasing its influence in those areas of life that shape the economic and political fate of developing nations. The soft power, one could argue, is spending and debt negotiations through bilateral instruments like the Belt and Road Initiative are widely commented on. Still, less well appreciated in the way that it links up to its new efforts to penetrate multilateral institutions. Organizations like the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, UNIDO, the UN Industrial Development Organization, FAO, and WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, may be obscure to many analysts and policymakers, but they organize the legal underpinnings of globalization. Even American observers, often rather blind to the dynamics within obscure multilateral institutions, have watched China's growing powers with alarm and woke up to this in time to forestall a Chinese bid for the leadership of WIPO. So we have here, in the multilateral system, a new player, central player, which is taking a broad space that was not there before. Hugely complicating all of this is that the American reaction to growing Chinese influence and Russian adventurism has not been to solidify cooperation with its allies, bolster its diplomacy in key multilateral arena, and align its bilateral pressure with multilateral action, but rather the opposite. The COVID crisis has brought all of this to the forefront, showing what it means to not have a coordinated global response. The baseline reality that emerges from all of this is twofold, in my view. First, that the multilateral system and the multilateral order is in serious peril, and that multilateral institutions are now an important zone of rivalry. Rivalry is the name of the game. Is it possible to design a new model of cooperation with rivalry? This is, for me, the question ahead of us. We should not envision multilateralism in a context like the Cold War. That's not going to happen. Rivalry will be the tone no matter who wins the elections in the United Nations, and will test our capacity to design a new order that can live within the boundaries of superpower competition while recognizing that it's in everyone's interest to retain cooperation. This new design should be a broader include a broader set of stakeholders. As it is clear in the Paris Accord, the need to bring local governments and cities is central. Same happens with civil society and private sector. It is also very important, and here comes my view from the South, to consider the role to be played by the Global South, retaining the representation of the distribution of power that the 21st century has. Much has been said about the coalitions of the willing. This is another potential tool to be used. But is this the only way forward to make the system dynamic and effective? Or can we find a new way of a multilateral system, multilateral institutions, by rethinking also the broad use of consensus that, in the context of rivalry, can only be a tool to block? Many possibilities to look into. We only need the willingness to move ahead. As I said earlier, I had more questions than answers. And my last question is, are we going to be able to do it? Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Susana. Very clear, very interesting, and a challenging talk. I think the way you started with your comment that multilateralism has been in trouble, we could say, for quite a while was important. Taking this back to 2002, as you said, with that first moment of, you could say, America first diplomacy at the very least. I was going to ask you a technical question almost about that. We can come to it maybe later on. I wondered whether the NATO bombing of Serbia back in 1999 without UN authorization might have already showed some cracks, you know, even prior to that. But I suppose it had a humanitarian look to it. We can maybe come back to that in a minute. Just to remind everyone, we've got another 35 minutes or so for this session. I'm just going to follow up with a couple of questions for Susana Malcorra. We've had a number of questions already in the Q&A line. Please keep adding them. And as I said, you can like the ones you like, which will knock them up the line a little bit. We will get to those in a minute. But I just wanted to draw on a couple of the big points that you made here. In particular, I was very struck by what you said about the dynamics of conflict, and that actually the way conflict operates right now in this non-great power, non-war way, it's about terrorism, it's about local violence. You said really that we don't have the tools to deal with it. And yet certainly sitting in Europe, and you're sitting in Europe in Madrid, this sense of an ever growing set of instability taking place through sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, an increasingly ungoverned part of the Middle East, continuation of ISIS and so on. When you look at that, is your conclusion then that there's no way that traditional mechanisms like the UN peacekeeping operations are going to act on this? Is it each region needs to look after its own security? Will Europeans have to step up and do this, not rely on the US? Could you just take your security, your first of your four challenges, and just take it out a little bit? Is this a place where multilateralism really needs almost to step back and maybe needs to focus more, we'll come to it in a minute, on SDGs and things like that? What would you say about the future of security and multilateralism?
Well, it's hard to say that multilateralism will step away from security. You know, when you go to the charter, this is an essential part of what the foundations of the UN has been built on. You know, as you read my experience, I had 4 years in peacekeeping operations as head of the Department of Field Support. So I had a first-hand understanding of what peacekeeping operations represent. It's one of the greatest creations of the UN system, you know, and it's so very interesting because there's no reference to such a thing anywhere in the charter, anywhere in the official papers. And it's still, when you think about a flagship of the UN, probably peacekeeping operations represent one of the key flagships of the UN, if not the one, the UN proper, I would say. Reality is that the way peacekeeping operations have been defined and constructed have been done in order to deal with conflicts between two countries. You know, you put yourself in the middle and you keep calm while there are efforts to resolve the conflict. That's not what happens today anymore. First, not even getting into terrorism. Most conflicts are internal to a country. So those conflicts are of a very, very different nature than just separating two different countries confronting each other. So that in itself is a challenge. And if you look into the presence in the Congo, for example, as one emblematic peacekeeping operation, is a very, very hard thing to do to handle the different tensions within the different groups within a country. So that already was something very, very difficult. And the fact that peacekeepers came essentially from countries from the global south and not always fully equipped to the level of what was required to persuade and dissuade was a challenge then. When you add to that, and let's go to Mali for a second, the reality of an internal conflict, but is absolutely, absolutely mixed with terrorism, the level of difference between the capabilities that the peacekeeping operation has and what is supposed to be countering and the ones who are on the other side have is amazing. But the first thing one needs to recognize is that essentially you are in a place where there's no peace to keep. So at least you need to change the name, you know, there's no peacekeeping, there's no peace to keep. And then you don't have all the resources that are required, the hardware that is required, that most of the time is in the hands of the most developed countries that very rarely are willing to get involved in peacekeeping operations. So there is a need to think through and to ask serious questions about what is the retooling required to adjust. And you mentioned in regional solutions. It could be a combination, but the legitimacy that has having the United Nations there, for me, is very, very important. So we need to tackle this, and this is, in my view, one of the areas of work that is badly needed and is needed now.
No, very important, and I think, as you said, the security being so much at the heart of the UN and of its entire sort of purpose, but the way you're describing it, it does feel like from another era. In a way, there's an adaptation that happened. A lot of the questions we've been getting are about kind of reform of UN system and different stuff. Before I turn to those questions, let me just ask you one more question from me, and then we'll have a good half an hour to be able to take questions from everyone. I know that when you, about a year ago, I think it was, maybe a bit more than a year ago now, you wrote a piece with Madeleine Albright that as I had a look at it, it struck me as relatively optimistic about the role of the G20. At least that the G20 was maybe an institution that could step in and take some of the weight at a time when, I think, as you noted, the UN structure and multilateralism had already been under strain for a good 15 plus years. You know, what's your assessment right now of the G20? Is it totally trapped by the great power rivalry, or is there something still inside it? What would you say about the G20, and where would you judge it today?
Well, I was, in fact, when Madeleine and I spoke about writing that piece, we thought that it was a way to energize somehow multilateralism through a tool that could be seen as a better place to hold some of the conversations that were needed. I must say that I am, if I were to write that piece again today, I wouldn't say what I have said, because this past year plus has proven that the G20 itself is not up to the task. And I think mainly because whoever chairs the G20 has to face the limits of the engagement or non-engagement by the big powers, essentially by China and the US. So yes, you can put on the table issues that maybe are more difficult to be discussed in the setting of a GA, for example, but will that be enough to further the conversation to a place where it becomes meaningful? Well, I had hoped yes. I am not so optimistic now.
Yeah, so no, but that's important to know, because I think some people still hold out hope, or you know, there was a step in there, but that's very important to have that clarification. Let me, as we've got one question in particular that seems to, you know, been sitting firmly at the top of our leaderboard here from Dina Mufti, which is really this core question about if powerful countries face no repercussion for breaking international laws, you know, what can we do? What is it possible to do to be able to enable international law to be upheld? Is this just one of those fundamental realities of international affairs? Or do you have any ideas from your time in the UN system and as a foreign minister, obviously, of an individual country? What can be done about this, the impunity of states that break what is considered international law?
Well, you know, that's the reason why I started my introductory remarks by referring to President Bush's speech before the GA, because if one can envision a contradiction, that is the President of the United States saying in the General Assembly hall, listen, we are not going to bother with whatever we have agreed to do. But you know, if you call that impunity, which is the right way to say it, you have to recognize that it was widely accepted. So, you know, in order to enforce or reinforce the established rules of the game, you have to have a willingness to do so. And of course, it's always more difficult to have that willingness when you speak about a big power. It's easier to do it with a smaller country, no question. That takes us to double standards. But sometimes there is a broad enough group of countries that resist that big power pressure. So to me, that's the only way. You know, the UN is a very imperfect institution, no question about it. But at least it's a place where rules have been defined, there is a framework, and if there is willingness, you can try and find ways to call a member state, as big as it might be, to abide by what had agreed to. The problem is that to do that, particularly when you're speaking about a big country, a big power, you need a coalition of a broad base. And that is what proved to not to be the case when I was referring to the case of Iraq.
I'm keeping an eye on all these questions that are coming in, which is wonderful. And just one follow-up question on this, because I know there's been a lot of talk, and it came from Manuel Mandro, if I've pronounced his name right, or Mindro, which is about this idea of reforming the vetoes, or finding certain things over which the veto countries could not veto. You know, the French have come up with some ideas, I think, on this idea of crimes against humanity, or something, you know, that you would take certain issues out of the veto space. Now, obviously, the veto countries would have to approve that. But are there any reforms that you, when you were there, were thinking, gosh, if I could be, I don't know, President of the US for the day, or the UN Secretary General of the day, I would really try to push this one reform. It would really make a difference. Was there anything that you've taken from that?
Well, I have to say that I don't foresee being the Secretary General for one day or for whatever time will help you change some of those things that need change. You know, they are in the hands of member states, and people forget that. You know, the Secretary General is not the president of the world. You know, and that old question is, he is more a secretary or a general. You know, but anyway, regarding a reform of the Security Council, I am very pessimistic about it. First of all, the only issue in which all 5 permanent members agree is not to reform the Security Council. mean, it's in their interest not to do it. It is true that some of the permanent members have come up with suggestions regarding a reduced level of the use of veto and humanitarian questions, certain human rights considerations, which starts to get tricky. I think that will be a help. You know, the fact that, for example, just a very recent example, the fact that member states were not able, I mean, the 5 permanent members, to be more specific, were not able to agree on a resolution on COVID for so many months. It was just incredible. You know, this is a health-related threat that poses a security risk to the world, no question about it. So there could be ways to do that. But it will not take us to the point where we will address all the issues that the veto power provides the permanent members. And that goes to the heart of changing the way the Security Council is designed.
Thank you. Just on a couple of the other questions that have come up here, I'm just going to take them in a sort of slightly random order. Robert Morland asked, you know, there's a great propensity to blame the US. I mean, as you said, the US helped create the United, it was one of the moving force behind the creation of the United Nations. But most complaints about the US start with how the US is failing, whether it goes back, obviously, as you noted, to President George W. Bush, whether it's the criticisms that are made of President Trump today. But to what extent do you feel others, you know, haven't been stepping up? I mean, you know, we are a long way from 1945, and it's almost as if the world has been slightly infantilized to constantly wait for US leadership. Are you one of the people who believes that without US leadership, there can be no international order at the moment, and we have to wait for them to wake up again? Or should other parts of the world be stepping forward in a more proactive way on multilateralism, not just in the UN, but more broadly? Where do you stand on this side about the role of the US?
Definitely on the second side. And this is why I started describing things from the US perspective. But if you look at my questions towards the end, I mean, first, we lived through many years after the fall of the Berlin Wall of US supremacy in the multilateral system. So that was a unique phase where the US, like it or not, was the only one setting the tone. And so that was not the standard, because during the Cold Period, things were different, but that's what many of us got used to see and live through in the post Berlin Wall fall. That will not happen again. I have no doubt it will not happen again. And people, it's true, often waited or hoped for the US to be the one who activated things. At the same time, we're very, very negative about the role of the US being the police of the world. So there was this contradiction that I think the US felt very strongly often, you know. So my sense is that we need to go to the next level. And we need to go to the next level. And that's why I had asked questions about, you know, coalition of the willing, bringing new players into the discussion, being able to build something that is not based on consensus only, which could allow to expand the notion of how you agree to things. You know, consensus is great if you are in an environment of full cooperation. If you are in an environment of tensions and rivalry, as we are, and we are going to be for the foreseeable future, consensus can be used as a way to block decisions. So yes, there are ways, and I think a coalition of countries interested in the multilateral system that have a broad representation, that represent both this from the South and the West and the East and the North, you know, all parts of the world that but share a perspective that cooperation is the only way to find solutions, I think that is a way to give impulse to the system, which is going to be a different system, no question about it.
And your point there leads to two questions I want to ask. One I'm going to ask, and then I'm just warning Sam Dawes that I might want to see if we can unmic him here because he's got a lot of experience on the UN as well. So Sam, you're forewarned. But there was a question from Fernando Herrero that asked, is there a view from the Global South? You just mentioned that you need coalitions of the willing that really are truly globally representative. Do you think the Global South, which is a huge term and covers a lot of diverse countries, but is there a perspective out there that's different, that if that voice was stronger, would perhaps see multilateralism evolve in a slightly different way? Would you define it, or simply everything you've said is a Global South view because of being from it yourself? But is there something in there that you would pull out?
No, I don't think there is, that anyone can assume the representation of the voice of the Global South, and that's part of the problem, as it is the case with the reform of the Security Council. Yeah, we all believe that it should be reformed. What is the voice of the reform of the Security Council? There are many voices there. And that's part of the problem we face. I think that honestly, I use the words Global South because that's easy to understand. I don't like it because I don't believe there is such a thing as the Global South. But in order to simplify, I use it as a term. For me, what is clear is that there has to be a confirmation on what are the basic principles and values we want to adhere to. That is, to me, a prerequisite. And from there, then we have to decide what are the issues in which we are ready to work together. The way the coalitions of the willing have evolved normally are pretty much on the sides of the institutions. They discuss and they agree, and they're really useful in many ways. They start to move certain issues ahead. My sense is that if one could envision a General Assembly where you could decide things by topics with subgroups of member states moving it ahead, but with the big support of being part of the General Assembly, although not everybody has adhered to it, that to me will boost energy, and then it will put the pressure on the ones who are not part of it. And that could create positive incentives. So I don't believe that you can think that, just to use two examples, Brazil on one side and India on the other side represent the same views on the Global South. And then you have the internal political dynamics that also change through democracy. So there is something bigger that one needs to agree to, which is those principles and values, and then say, okay, what are the issues and what issues we are going to work together for, and get the signature signing of the General Assembly.
Just one quick follow-up on this, because I think it's so important. As you said, there's no one voice, but the one thing that seems to be interesting about the group of countries you've mentioned as you've gone along in the Global South is a much less, if I can say, almost ideological, I was going to say a less values-based approach. I mean, what's interesting, a democracy like India seems to be very comfortable being part of a conversation on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. A country like Brazil made an effort to try to discuss with Turkey its own initiative on Iran. There seems to be, Western countries in the North, the Atlantic community, seem to feel they're guardians of a particular set of values, and you either have to come in and belong to them or you don't. It strikes me that at times countries of the Global South seem to be a little bit more open-minded, but I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not, about working across borders. They might work with China on something, they might work with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, but the principles and the values seem to be less the determinant, and it's more simply about getting things done. Would that be an unfair generalization?
Well, it is unfair in certain ways. First of all, when you think about the Western and the North and representing the values, you can see many examples that that's not the case. So let's stay calm in the front. What I think is true is that the UN has been shaped by the West. And beyond talking about principles and values, the ways, the culture, the prevailing ways of doing business is Western. And that to me is a limitation that the UN has, because the world is much more nuanced. Then you can ask for standards. And again, I will be cautious with the standards because there are double standards all over the place. But it is true, in my view, that when you want to be a real global institution, an institution that has represented the whole of the world, you need to have certain flexibility to build bridges. The problem is, which is the level of flexibility? What are the limits? And of course, I personally believe there are certain principles and values that should be re-adhered to. If we were to be refoundational, we should go and say, yes, we adhere to this. And that is tricky because, and let's not forget, we think that a liberal democracy is the way to go. There are examples of successful societies where that's not the case. And you can argue, are they really successful? Big question mark. But there are societies that have taken, and I'm talking China here, have taken 600 million people out of poverty. So there are tensions there that one needs to recognize. And the point I want to make is you don't fix them without listening to the other and trying to find a common middle ground.
Right, no, absolutely. So let me just move sideways a little bit to a comment that was made by Barry Bain, that there's been a much greater involvement recently of the private sector, civil society in helping create the SDGs. Do you think this is helping reinforce the UN, that there's a new, more bottom-up approach? And I think this is something that Sam Dawes was going to ask a question about as well. Sam, if you're there, we're going to try and unmic you. Are you there, Sam? Otherwise, I'll ask your question.
Can you hear me, Robin?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Sam, because I think your question was on the same line as Barry's. Would you mind asking the question to introduce yourself and to Susana?
Thank you. And Susana Malcorra, thank you for such tremendously useful insights today and your long-term contribution to international organizations. My question was around the bottom-up design of the Paris Climate Agreement. It was innovative at a time that support for treaty-based solutions were already on the wane. And you said, I think quite correctly, that the current major power rivalry will remain the context regardless of whether Biden or Trump win in November. So what are the implications of this new context of rivalry for the future design of international responses to new challenges?
Well, thank you for your comments, first of all. I will say, let me first refer to what you mentioned, Robin. The participation of new players, new stakeholders, in my view, is central. We saw that in the case of the SDGs. We started with a broad consultation, citizen base, and that really gave energy to the process. And then we realized when we started to speak about financing for development, that there was no way we could address that only with government resources. And not to talk about ODA. ODA is a minor piece on this infrastructure. So we came to realize that only with the private sector being part of it, we could implement it. So there is no question about it. The problem is that everything that we do in this regard is ad hoc. And my sense is that when we think about a new way for the UN to move on, that should be more formalized. We should be able to have not only a voice after the 193rd representative spoke, then have the private sector coming in, but have a real input and of real weight. That is something that we need to think through. Of course, the United Nations has been created as a member state organization. That's true. The question is, in the type of challenges we face today, is it possible to think that we are going to address them just through and by a member state organization? And how can we enlarge it to a certain extent? Going to your point on the question of how to move forward in environmental rivalry, that is to me the question. You know, I don't like the word reform of the United Nations. I think we have spoken about reform of the United Nations for so long that people get sick and tired of it. But there has to be a profound rethinking that accepts the notion that we are going to be living through, as I said, the foreseeable future. One doesn't know how many years, but for quite a few years at least, with this tension between the two big powers, and that will not go away. But the fact that there is tension doesn't mean necessarily that we cannot find ways of cooperation. So to me, that's the biggest opportunity that we might have out of the elections in the US. That yes, tensions will be there and will be big tensions, but still we can park them to discuss certain issues. And maybe in doing so, we can stabilize certain areas of common work that will produce a more effective and a more efficient United Nations. I don't think we are going to be able to do that for all, no question, but if we can start to do that in certain areas of common ground, that will make a difference. If not, I think we have no choice but to define coalitions of the willing and work in that regard.
We're getting close to the end, but we've got so many good questions here. I want to try and get at least 2 or 3 more in, if people can be patient and stay with us. I want to go to another question that's at the top of the list. It's quite a different question. Before I turn to it, I want to warn Dee Smith. Dee, I may want to come to you because I think you've got a very interesting question about social contract. So be ready in case I try to ask you to unmic, and if you don't want to, that's fine, I'll ask your question, but just to warn you. But first I want to ask the question by David Walker. He's on the board of a big international education organization. I think I know which one it is, but as he didn't mention it, I won't mention it. But he's worried that isolationism and nationalism are going to permeate into the education system, that they could end up turning people off the kind of spread of international education that we'd seen in recent years, but it may end up actually becoming, I think if I'm not over editing his question, it may become a negative feedback loop where actually education starts to become one of those battlegrounds as well, either simply because you can't travel, but also people start to almost weaponize it slightly. What's your sense on that question? I think it's a very interesting one.
Well, honestly, I haven't thought about it in that way. I see education as an opportunity, but it is true, there is a risk there. And it is also true that what this pandemic has brought to us could increase the risk. One could argue that through virtual means, you can reach out to more people, but the personal contact, the cultural aspect, the getting together in campus or in schools makes a big difference. So in my view, and if I were to bet on something, I will bet on young people. I mean, they are really very concerned about global public goods most of the time. So I will side on the positive regarding education. I will say I see that as an opportunity. And if you look at the way China behaves in this regard, China really sends students outside to be exposed to different views. So
so far, I'm starting to wonder whether, well, Chinese parents certainly do.
But that is fed by the current concern about the pandemic. There is no question about it, which adds another silver lining. I mean, it's something that we could discuss further, but my sense.
But there's a real tightening of control in China over education in China. Chinese universities now need to abide much more strictly by, let's say, the political direction coming from Beijing. It's made to be explicitly so. So I think Chinese parents may be wanting to get their kids out, but I'm wondering if it becomes a slightly more nationalist space there as well.
Yeah, my view is that, and again, I might be wrong here. I still see education as an opportunistic gain. You know, I don't, and not only opportunistic, I would say strategic gain. But you know, that could be the case. You know, that we will be in deep trouble.
A couple of last questions. One is on, we had two questions actually from Horacio Sanchez Caballero, who actually is from your country, and also Simone Urbani-Grechi from Italy, both asking about the EU and where you see, and you're based again in Madrid right now, do you see the EU almost as some sort of modern player in a new form of multilateralism? I mean, it's not a state. It's focused very much on regulation, and you pointed how important that is, and the Chinese have noted how important regulation is. What do you think about the EU as a player in the space of future multilateralism, especially now it's got maybe a little bit more energy after its COVID recovery fund?
Let me first state here something that is important. I am a big admirer of the construction of the EU. I think it's one of the biggest achievements of mankind. And when I say this, often Europeans look at me and say, what are you talking about? If you think where the Europeans came from and where they are today with the EU, it's just amazing. Of course, the EU as such is not represented in the United Nations. You know, it has an observer role, it has a coordinating role. But my view is that the EU has a critical role to play in itself and through its member states. When you think about this confrontation between China and the US, the EU could play a stabilizing role, could be one of the key vectors to find those issues where you can put aside confrontation and work towards finding a shared solution. So and the EU, of course, it takes very, very high the values and the principles of the United Nations. There again, the only risk is to have a view that is Western-centric and somehow does not embrace enough the global reality of the world today.
So we're on our last two questions here. I'm going to pull together the one from D. Smith, who sadly has had to pull off the call, but with the one from William Crawley. D. Smith asked about, I think your point, is there a real erosion of the social contract taking place at the moment, between citizens and the state? A sense that in a way the state can't protect them anymore. The loss of the social contract is undermining multilateralism, is what she was asking. William Crawley said there is this idea that cosmopolitan organizations that represent, non-state actors are really representatives of citizens of nowhere. So you've got this sort of this contest right now between governments trying to say, no, we will give you a social contract and protect you, but then these more cosmopolitan organizations try to think about a global good. Is this a unique tension, you think, of the moment that's going to affect multilateralism?
Well, first of all, this is an issue that we can discuss for the next 2 hours at least. But let me just give you headlines here. No question there is a tension there that requires a new social contract. No question about it. And this is something that each government is facing, And in my view, this comes at least from the 2007-8 financial crisis, where citizens saw how fast they were to react their governments to address the issues of certain sectors or the financial sector or the automotive sector, etc., and how little they were ready to address their issues. And you see people today, 10 plus years after, earning less than what they were earning then. So that clear notion of us not being part of the discussion as citizens, I think has sunk very, very deeply in many places in the world. I think that has created many of the reactions we have seen in the streets. I think that has created some of the moves for nationalism, because there is also an association between this reality and the globalization has taken my job away. Nobody bothers explain the impact of technology, which is a key element there. So all this is a mixed bag of things that requires a restatement of a social compact, a social contract, no question. But if we were to keep that at the national level and ignore the need for some kind of a coordination at the global level, some kind of a way to foster some of these issues beyond states, I think will be very short to deliver what is needed. And let me give you just a brief example. Women's questions. If it was not for Beijing, I bet you the issues would have not moved as they did. I mean, the fact that policies have been implemented in so many countries in so many ways is only because the legitimacy of the UN putting pressure on member states made it possible. I'm very concerned now that with different arguments, there is a pushback there. So I see that issue not only being addressed at the national level, which is needed, but I need the weight, the moral weight of the UN ratifying the need for that. So it's one example, but I think there are many like that.
You've given me, and I'm not going to deprive myself of this last question, even though we're over time. You've given me a little bit of a segue. The book that you wrote a couple of years ago, which has been translated into English earlier this year, In Pursuit of What Matters, Passion for the Bottom Line, I noticed it had a subtitle. It's a long title already, I might add, but in any case, it has a subtitle, which is Female Leadership in the Face of Big Decisions. So my closing question, which you don't have 4 hours to answer, is there something different, do you think, about female leadership in the face of big decisions?
Well, I have to say there are differences between men and women, not only in decision making. So that only gives you a hint that decision processes are handled differently by women and men. My view is that we need leadership, and in leadership positions, a fair representation of the diversity of society. And the first diversity that society has is gender. Mm-hmm. For me, we will only get to a good way of delivering results, of delivering solutions, of having impact if that is fairly represented. I think there are views and approaches that women have that are unique to women. And that doesn't mean that they are the only way to do it, but it's very important to introduce that perspective. And my sense is that COVID has shown a few examples in that regard, showing women leadership with good results.
That's true. Look, we're definitely over time, and I felt we get on. I apologize for those questions I didn't get to. There were still a few left at the end, despite my best efforts to jam some of them together. Susana Malcorra, thank you very much for taking the time, for really giving this issue the thought you did in your lecture at the beginning, for then taking a lot of questions on very diverse subjects. But it is a big topic, and it's one that draws, I think, usefully on the diversity of experience you've had yourself. So on behalf of all of our members at Chatham House, all those who participate in this meeting, thank you very much for taking the time. We look forward to welcoming you to London one of these days, hopefully not too far away. Please keep well and safe. And to all of our members as well who participated, thank you for joining. Hope you're keeping well and safe. We hope to welcome you back, those of you who can and wish, physically at Chatham House at some point in the future. But for the meantime, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Susana. Hasta luego. Hasta la próxima.
Hasta la próxima, and thanks to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.